Thank you, Grace, for a beautiful introduction, and thank you all for being here, and thanks to NOFA Vermont for inviting me to be a part of this gathering today. The theme of the conference being Celebrating Our Interdependence has been on my mind for quite a number of years. I've been thinking about this concept probably most of my adult life. I've worked across different movements. I've had the pleasure of working in the environmental justice movement, economic justice movement, social justice movement. About 25 years ago or so, I was working at Greenpeace. In fact, I think a couple of my colleagues from those Greenpeace days are, oh yeah, there they are, it's waving at me, are in the room. And we had the honor and the pleasure of working with some communities fighting against toxic waste incinerators and pulp and paper mills that were polluting their communities. And in the midst of that work, Greenpeace asked me if I would consider switching campaigns to work on fisheries issues. And at first I thought, how do you organize fish? How to do that? Well, I couldn't wrap my head around it. And then I started to read some stories, read some articles, saw some pictures, and I saw some stark similarities between the fight that the fishing communities were launching against the corporate takeover of their lives, essentially, of their fishing rights, of their fishing grounds, of their fishing communities, and what I knew from back home in California of what family farmers were dealing with, especially what I was learning about farm workers many, many years ago. And a lot of the placards they were holding up in their protests looked really similar to the placards that the people in East Liverpool, Ohio were holding up. And pretty quickly, it became clear to me that these two issues, these three issues really, are not that different. And what they have in common is this fight against global movement of capital that is putting the whale in the way, the land in the way, the air in the way. And all these people are really fighting for the same outcome, which is to regain some level of self-determination about what they breathe, what they eat, how they work, and how their communities are allowed to exist. That was an important moment for me. And what probably one of the first pieces, or first points in time where this concept of interdependence really came to roost, at least in my heart and mind. And so I agreed to work on fisheries issues. I told a friend of mine, I'm going to do it. I'm going to switch campaigns. I'm going to move to Gloucester. And he said, first things first, those of you who are not from Massachusetts, that you got to learn how to pronounce the name of the town you're moving to, which is actually Gloucester. And the locals, I think, eliminate about half of the vowels in there. And so that was 25 years ago. And I've learned a lot from the fishing communities. I've learned that there's a difference between people who fish and people who extract seafood, much like there's a difference between farmers and agribusiness. And I've learned that if you actually want a healthy marine ecosystem, you need healthy fishing communities, much like if you want a healthy land food system, we need healthy farming communities. A lot of similarities. As Grace mentioned, now I coordinate the work of an organization the last 10 years called the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance. Actually, the name is changing this year to North American Marine Alliance because the breadth of our work, the reach of our work has really gone beyond the Northwest Atlantic region. And one of the reasons for that, actually, is because we're kleptomaniacs. We like to steal ideas, and we like to replicate them in other places. One of the ideas we stole right after starting to work at NAMA was the concept of community-supported agriculture. We learned from all of you who've been running CSAs for a long time to create a model for community-supported fisheries. Because we felt that fishing communities needed to reconnect with their communities, and people needed to look at fishermen not as just what we've been branding them, which is sort of rapers and pillagers of the ocean, but actually food providers, people who are part of the food web that we have. And the community-supported fishery really began to take hold. What started as one project in late 2007, early 2008, today spans North America, and actually there's community-supported fisheries in Europe, and I think the last one that sprung up in Australia a couple of years ago. And I believe there's a couple in Mexico and some in Canada. So it's our ability to learn from you, again, that interconnectedness of the land and seafood system that has really helped us broaden our reach at NAMA. We did become the first non-farming organization member of the National Family Farm Coalition, as Grace mentioned, and as you've been experiencing with the loss of Enid, NFFC experienced the loss about 3 years ago, when many of you knew Kathy Ozer, who had been the longtime director of NFFC, who passed away from cancer. In the middle of that search, this idea of a shared leadership model emerged. Once again, when I was approached with the idea, it was that interconnectedness, that ability for us to kind of cross those boundaries and work together towards shared outcomes that really inspired me. We didn't merge, just to be clear, because we actually realized in our work, we're fighting mergers. We're fighting consolidation. We're fighting power being taken away from one entity and accumulated into the other. So we intentionally actually decided to capitalize on our interconnectedness and keep the two organizations legally separate and empowered to do what they needed to do to fulfill their individual missions, but really capitalize on the synergy and the interconnectedness and the interdependence that we have on each other as land and seafood systems and people who provide that food for the rest of us. Before that, though, when Kathy was still alive, the week before the 2016 elections, the NAMA team and board members and the NFFC, some of the board members from both organizations and our teams got together at the Blue Mountain Center down in the Adirondacks. I don't know if any of you have been down there. It's a beautiful place to be inspired to think and scheme and strategize. What we were experiencing and what we were really seeing was during the election cycle, the hatred and the vitriol that we were sensing and we were hearing and we were feeling was mostly being blamed on white rural America, which are people who we work with. They're actually, the farmers and fishermen are primarily white rural people. And we realized that the people who lead our work and who we work with are being blamed for hate and divisiveness. And we realized that we needed to take some responsibility for undoing some of that. Not the undoing the impression people had of the people who we work with and we value, whose lives we value, whose work we value. But we also acknowledge that some of it is real. But we realized that a lot of the hate and what was being translated into hate was really coming from a deep place of pain and anger and the sense that their concerns, their economic disempowerment, their inability to hold their communities together, to work the land, to work on their boats, was really being ignored. And they weren't being addressed by any political party. And so, as much as we recognize that rural America isn't a monolith, we wanted to acknowledge that there are some who fit that bill, but most are really experiencing grief in a really deep way, and that we needed to address that. And I forgot to further my slides, so I'll just go through them real quick. So this is NAMA, this is NFFC, and with the shared leadership model, we have a beautiful logo that we share for both. So in that Blue Mountain Center gathering, knowing everything that we acknowledge, we also wanted to do something about it. So we decided that we really needed to capitalize on the energy that was in the communities that we work with, and that we needed to take the first step to take our own blinders off and to really dive deeply into the experiences that these communities are having. We wanted to really show that the rural communities and the urban communities have a lot in common, and that what we're taught by the dominant narrative that we should hate people who don't look like us, talk like us, pray like us, eat like us, think like us, is really seeded by the same forces that are taking away our rights to fish, our seeds, our land, our rights to water, and they're essentially capitalizing on that sense of fear and grief that our communities have been facing. So we felt that our first responsibility was to really build that connectedness between rural and urban and people who are different from each other or think they're different from each other. And we've realized that one of the main common denominators we have is food. Who eats here? Thank you. A couple people raised their hand. The rest of you are fasting for your lives? What's going on here? And aside from air and water, food is really our biggest common denominator, and it's one that we celebrate around often. And so we really wanted to use the concept of celebrating around food and how food brings us together to build a movement and strengthen our movement. And so we came up with this idea that we were going to declare our interdependence between family farmers and community-based fishermen, and write up this thing called the Declaration of InterDependence. And I quickly went to GoDaddy and bought the URL. The staff at NAMA thinks I have a GoDaddy problem, which is true. Anytime we think of an idea, I immediately go and buy it. We have a bank of URLs if you ever need to use them. But then we realized we're not as brilliant as we think we are. Started to dig a little bit. And we went way back to 1944, examples of people thinking about interdependence. In response to a request from leaders of the Jewish and Christian faiths, outlined his idea. This is Will Durant, outlined his ideas for a Declaration of Interdependence, lodged at a gala dinner in Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel in 1945. Apparently Betty Davis and a bunch of other Hollywood types were there. I put the website on there in case you want to go look at it. This is what the document looked like. And then move a little bit forward. September 1969 in Berkeley, the unanimous Declaration of Interdependence by Clifford Humphrey. You can also look up. And this one was really designed to address the fact that we need to be in harmony with nature. So a lot of the elements of this Declaration of Interdependence is really focused on human relationships to nature. Connected to that, in 1992, the David Suzuki Foundation, in conjunction with the 1992 UN Earth Summit in Rio, came up with the Declaration of Interdependence. We didn't have a brilliant idea, but it didn't matter to us. We were going to do it anyway. Oh, wait, there's another one. That's right. Let's see if I can make this work. This is from 2011.
When in the course of human events,
在人类活动的过程中
In the course of human events,
عندما نكون في مضمار الأحداث البشرية.
Quand dans le cours des événements humains,
becomes increasingly necessary
Para reconocer
to recognize the fundamental qualities
that connect us. That connect us. That connect us.
the truths we hold,
To be self-evident.
Alors nous devons réévaluer les vérités que nous tenons pour acquises.
That all humans are
created equal.
And all are connected.
比如每一个人都是生来平等并且联系在一起的
That we share the pursuits of life,
La recherche d'une vie meilleure.
liberty
happiness,
والغذاء.
water, agua,
Shelter. El refugio. Seguridad.
education,
Justice.
and hopes for a better future.
That our collective knowledge, economy,
technology, and environment are
fundamentally interdependent.
ketergantungan kita.
that what will propel us forward
لأن لدينا شجاع على التقدير.
Is our curiosity,
Curiosité.
rasa ingin tahu kita.
Our ability to forgive,
kemampuan kita untuk memaafkan,
our ability to appreciate,
היכולת שלנו להעריך,
Our courage.
our courage,
Keberanian kita.
and our desire to connect.
شجاعة ورغبتنا في التواصل.
D'être connecté.
That these things we share. في نهاية المطاف إلا تطور.
To our fullest common potential.
Le cose che noi teniamo insieme sono le cose del nostro mondo.
我们应该严肃对待我们的问题。
We should never take ourselves too seriously.
Kwa sababu jambo jingine linalotuunganisha
هو قدرتنا على الضحك.
Dan upaya kita untuk belajar dari kesalahan kita.
So that we can learn from the past,
understand our place in the world,
Memahami tempat kita di dunia. And use our collective knowledge.
to create a better future.
去创造一个更美好的未来。
so perhaps it's time
Jadi mungkin sudah saatnya kita
that we, as a species,
sebagai spesies
as a species.
Love to laugh.
que disfruta de reír,
Love to laugh.
poser questions,
Bukan pertanyaan,
Ask questions and connect.
do something radical
and true. For centuries,
We have declared
independence
这几百年，我们一直在宣称独立。
Perhaps it's now time.
that we, as humans, declare our interdependence.
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 So despite all the evidence to the contrary, we assumed that we were still brilliant and we were going to come up with our own Declaration of InterDependence. But we decided that we were going to really focus this one on food. What does our food Bill of Rights look like? What are our grievances with the current food system? And what are our hopes and aspirations? We have a whole preamble. I just put the little blurb of it up here. We've already come up with a draft. But we know we're not perfect, and clearly not as brilliant as we think. And so we've been seeking input on this draft for the last couple of years since we've written it. So my task to you for about 5 minutes is to turn to the person next to you and really talk about the Declaration of InterDependence. What are our demands in a full Bill of Rights? What would you include in a full Bill of Rights? I think you might have some stickies going around, or if not, if you have a piece of paper, write it on your hands, whatever. There are some pieces of paper that we don't want you all to throw those things away. I really do want to capture them and take them back to NFFC and NAMA to incorporate them in the current draft of the Declaration of InterDependence. But spend a few minutes, talk to the person next to you, come up with what you think are the elements of the Food Bill of Rights. And then after the 4 or 5 minutes is up, we'll ask about only 3 of you to share something with the rest of us, and the rest of your feedback we want to collect before the day is over so that we can incorporate it into our thinking. So 5 minutes, go. Glad to see and hear from up here that sounds like there were some great conversations being held. As I said, I want to really get 3 people to share what you all came up with. And the rest of you, there are butcher paper type things by the doors. If you can either write whatever you came up with or put your sticky pads, the Post-its on there as you're leaving. We really do want to, oh, hi, Christy. We really do want to capture these and incorporate them into the current draft, which we'll then share back with all of you. So please do that. So 3 people, and don't be hurt if I don't call on your hands. We just don't have that much time. So 3 people, who wants to, please, come up to the mic. Maybe you can tell us who you are and what you do and what your world is and what you guys came up with.
Okay. Excuse me. So my name is Human. And we came up with presumptive eligibility.
Presumptive.
And this has been something that, in terms of food as a human right, something that I have been working on as a person interested in food policy. And I've been working on this actually with some people where I'm from, Maryland, Washington, D.C. area. And so presumptive eligibility, for those who don't know what that means, I know I'm turned back to most of the people in the room. So what that means is if you go to 3 Squares, so a food assistance program in Vermont, and you say, I'm hungry, right? Or I need to feed my kids, I'm out of work, my foot was broken or something, and I don't get my benefits. Or your first time going to go get food stamps, maybe you have a language barrier issue, right? What does that office say? That office says, you need to prove to us that you are hungry. And then you got to prove to us through paperwork and documents and ID and a bunch of other stuff that I'm not familiar with personally, that you are hungry and you need food. So presumptive eligibility means, as we were saying with Peggy and Wyatt sitting here in my group, we were saying, you can go into this office and say, I'm hungry, and then they just give you the benefits, and that's it. So you don't have to prove to anyone. You don't have to prove to anyone else except yourself that you're hungry, and that's all that means.
Thank you. We already have someone at the mic back there. All right, anybody who wants to come up here, take your space.
Hi. My name's Evan. I live in Western Massachusetts, and I work with native pollinators and wild ecosystems. And I really appreciate the opportunity to think about not just the Food Bill of Rights, but also the Declaration of InterDependence. So I'm going to offer some comments. One thing that struck me was the opening line, when in the course of human events. I feel like perhaps restating that as when in the course of planetary events, to think about all ecosystems, all animals and plants.
Definitely.
Our impact is obviously significant. And then there's the line, I'll just read it for those who don't have it in front of them. So when in the course of perhaps planetary events, it becomes necessary for one people to join with another and to assume among the powers of the earth. I felt that we've done a lot of assuming as humans. I feel like we've done a lot of taking, resource use without necessarily giving back to what other species need. And that's why we have a biodiversity loss across the planet. So I don't know if this is exactly the right language, but instead of assume among the powers of the earth, I thought perhaps something like cooperatively work alongside, or, somehow describing a giving back to those that don't have a voice. Other than that, I think it's great, and I appreciate the opportunity for the dialogue.
Thank you so much. And again, some of you have gone deeper than what I thought, and this is exactly what we want to hear. So please don't throw those away. We have one person at the back, and then I'm sorry. You two have standing in line, but we've got one person before you, and we're going to stop at 3. Yes.
Thank you. Ditto to what the last guy said, definitely.
Yeah, let's give him a...
Sovereignty principles, not human-centered, much like the last guy said there. Food security, traditional access, dignity for food and farm workers, not tied to money or capitalist motivated. Agroecology centered, so an economy based on agroecology. The right to keep your culture. Appreciation and honoring putting forward bugs and fungi and water and microbes and all the other beings that are much smaller than us, and especially those that we don't know about yet. And having a whole systems approach.
Thank you. For those of you who are interested to see the whole draft that we came up with, the longer preamble, and there's, I think, 17 or 18 points. Some of them resemble what some of you have said already. Different words may be slightly written differently. Some of you have come up with some words that we haven't even thought of. I'm happy to share those with you. I think Grace already has a link to that Google Doc, and we're happy to share those with you if you want to just go in there and edit it and add your comment. Don't delete anything, but add your comments to it so that we can then kind of see what we come up with collectively, and we'll share that with you. Thanks for participating in that exercise. That's really valuable for us. So what? So what? So we do all of this, and so what? We keep getting asked that question all the time. So what? What are you going to do with all this stuff? As Grace mentioned, after the shared leadership model was launched in 2018, we rented a 30-foot RV, and we hit the road. We ended up traveling about 13,000 miles, visited 67, 98% of them were rural farming and fishing communities, farming, ranching, and fishing communities, I should say. You can't see all 67 on here. Some of the places were so close to each other, there's sort of an overlap. And clearly we missed a big chunk of the country, but we only had 2 months, so we did our best to show up where we could. The so what lessons for me really came from this tour. Things that I already knew or suspected I knew were really reinforced during this America the Bountiful tour. In fact, at first I wanted to call it the Declaration of InterDependence tour. And one of the NAMA staffs actually came up with the name America the Bountiful. It turns out other people have America. We're not as brilliant as we think we are all the time. But anyway, that name stuck, and there's actually a website called americathebountiful.org that you can go to, and you can read our postcards from the road. One of the lessons that we learned during the America the Bountiful tour actually was that we need to be in communities more often. And so even since the tour ended, we have continued to build in visits to communities. We can't assume everybody's going to be able to come to a conference as beautiful as this conference is and as rich as it is. We just realized that in order for us to really better understand the people's lives and struggles and we have to be where they work, where they play, where they struggle, where they grieve. And so you'll see, even since the tour ended, you'll see other postcards from the road on that website. These were the 4 themes. We talk about interdependence, interconnectedness. Whether we were on a boat, on a dock, in a ranch, in a fishing farm, and visiting a CSA, visiting all these different machinations of aggregation places, these were the common themes that came up for us. And they're not very pretty. People really feeling this sense of isolation, this lack of worth. People don't understand what I do, and therefore they don't value what I do. This loss of community with consolidation and the corporate takeover of our social systems have come, loss of communities. The number of stories we heard from people of, we used to have 3 restaurants and 2 movie theaters and 5 banks and a community center, and now we have a Dollar General and a Bank of America and a gas station. And that's our grocery stores, the Dollar General. And this economic disempowerment, which is not getting paid what you're worth, which takes us back to the issue of lack of worth. The idea that all of you who farm or ranch, anybody fish here? All right, 1 person. How many of you put marine-based fertilizers on your farm? How many of you feed some kind of a marine-based feed to your animals? You fish. You are connected to seafood more than you think. And that's one of the reasons why incorporating, how many of you eat sea salt? Put sea salt on your, there you go. Seaweed. On your sushi, all right. So this is why it's really important for me, as I'm learning about fishing communities' work over the last 25 years, to connect the farming and fishing world together. Seafood is the only thing we eat that actually has the word food in it. Yet most of our food system conversations have not embraced it. But when you all raise your hands, you all have a relationship with seafood. And this is another relationship you have with seafood. These 4 concerns that fishermen and farmers and ranchers have. Economic disempowerment, much like with farmers, fishermen aren't getting paid their cost of production. Cost of production, I wish we could get cost of production for all of you. What about half of the mortgage on your home, or clothes for school, or books, or whatever it is? Those aren't taken into account in the current formula for cost of production. So farmers and fishermen feeling the same issues. And this broke my heart the most. Nobody comes here. One of the ways, actually the main way we picked these locations to go to is when we decided to do the tour, I put a note out to the membership of National Family Farm Coalition and the network that NAMA represents. So we're hitting the road, where do you want us to go? And the number of emails that came back that started with, we're probably not worth your time, but this is where we live, if you want to come visit us. Those people got an immediate pin on the map. Whether they wanted to visit or not, they were going to get a visit. Nobody comes here. I think the reason that really resonated with me is we're talking about what a lot of you represent, the first set of hands that touch our food and they feel like nobody comes here. You know, we heard stories about, well, you know, we're not a partisan organization, but in many of these cases in rural communities, the stories were about the Democratic Party not showing up in their communities because they're sort of written off rural populations. Nobody comes here, and I think we need to go there more often. What we asked also was, what do you want us to do? As two national organizations, how can we improve things? And you know, we go back to interconnectedness, the interdependence on each other. Everybody talked about connecting with other providers and aligning across movements, because we can learn from each other. We are truly interdependent on each other's knowledge, inspiration, laughter, music, cultures. They want deeper conversations. They want to learn from each other. You know, the number of places where we went to where we would share a story. I remember this one vivid story when we were in Wyoming and we heard about the Wyoming's Food Freedom Act. Does anybody know about Wyoming's Food Freedom Act? You would, but you don't count. So in Wyoming, they wanted to gain some level of food sovereignty, and it's a relatively conservative state. They were able to build connections across their movements, and they identified those points of interdependence and interconnectedness, and they passed this law called the Food Freedom Act that essentially allows them to sell anything they want, as long as those who are buying it are aware of what they're buying. So you can sell your chickens, you can sell your stuff that you make in your cottage industry sort of places, and farmers have access to those markets, and both for prepared foods and raw foods. And we were talking about the story in the other communities that we visited, and people's eyes would light up and say, we want to learn about that. How can you connect us with the people in Wyoming who started that? So connecting people with each other to learn from each other, to increase our sovereignty and our agency around the kind of food we want to provide and grow and raise and catch. And I want to focus a little bit on this word providers. We often refer to farmers, fishermen, ranchers as producers. And at Farm Aid last year in Wisconsin, there was one of the indigenous leaders who was there said there are no separate words for farmers, ranchers, and fishermen in their language, and they're all called providers. And that really hit me in the right place. So now every time I open my mouth to say producers, I actually replace it with providers, because I think that speaks really to what you all do. You're providing something the rest of us can't provide for ourselves. So through all of this, after the tour, we decided, okay, we really do have to declare our interdependence. We really have to continue working on building these cross-sector movements. And I was given a talk last year and talked about breaking down silos, and Christine actually said silos have an important function on a farm, so don't break those down. So how do we talk about getting rid of those walls and really building our connections with each other? And it's through gatherings where we actually acknowledge that there is an interdependence to be had and celebrated. At the end of the tour, and I appreciated seeing the word love in the song, and by the way, I appreciate hearing the song. I can't sing worth anything. And I remember at a couple of Food Solutions New England meetings, the Vermont delegation were the ones getting up and singing and dancing first. So I'm not surprised to have be in Vermont and have you guys sing. But these are the 4 themes that in the end, hearing all of that grief about lack of self-worth and isolation and wanting to know what people's hopes were. These are the 4 words that I walked away with after those 2 years. And I don't use the word love very often. In fact, I've sort of avoided it probably my entire adult life because I sort of associated with being an overused, sappy word that people probably misuse most of the time. But the experience that I had in those 2 months of people really loving what they do, truly loving what they do, and the people they're working to feed, and the animals that they're interacting with, and the soil and the water, and just made me really appreciate and look at the word love through a whole different lens. And worth, having people feel their worth became really much more important. So acknowledging someone's good work, whether it's through paying them a fair price or actually verbally acknowledging or a pat on the back, again, these were beginning to show me my own pitfalls as a human being, that I wasn't having love enough, talking about love enough in my life, not offering worth to people enough, and then hope. We are living in times where it's really hard to have hope, but once you go and you see people who, I remember having a conversation with a young farmer in Salon, Iowa, and the last day I said, I really appreciate you having invested in getting this farm, and she's actually a member of the National Young Farmers Coalition, and she said, there is no other option. And so I really appreciate that. Every time a farmer, you guys put a seed in the ground, it's your way of manifesting hope. Whenever fishermen put a net in the water, that's their way of manifesting hope. And I feel like as advocates, as activists, waking up every day, doing purpose-driven work, that's our way of having hope. And possibilities, there are endless possibilities, but unfortunately, we're told that they don't exist. We're told that there's only one way. You get big or you get out. You have to focus on volume. You have to treat the animals. I remember visiting a dairy farmer who had about 125 heads of cattle, and she said, we want to put a manure lagoon, but the only one USDA comes and gives us is for 1,000 head dairy farm. We don't want to have 100,000 heads of dairy. So creating possibilities where the current system doesn't offer them to you by collaborating with each other, by learning from each other, has to be a key part of it. When we came home, I actually wrote a blog for us. The closing blog was Love, Worth, Hope, and Possibilities. So when I came home, one of my neighbors had set up this little thing, which I really appreciated. It's sort of my reminder of what I learned on the road. But then we keep going back to so what? All of this is good, but so what? There is one word that we haven't talked about that really, for me, is the most important so what in all of this. I feel like a lot of the issues that we're experiencing, the unrest we're feeling around the world, the hatred, the divisiveness, all of it is leading to a level of lack of peace that we're all experiencing, whether it's in our individual lives, in our communities, in the collective world. And if we can really tap into our interconnectedness, our interdependence, and celebrate the love and the worth in each other's love, celebrate the love, celebrate each other's worth, explore those possibilities, and have hope with each other, that we increase the chances of the peace that we're all really seeking, that we're finding is really hard to find these days. So to me, this is the biggest so what of it all, is peace. And for me, it comes from this interdependence. So thank you again for having me here, and I look forward to it.